have been a logistics administrator for the Keth Dominion for 31 years. I have never held a weapon. I have never served on a warship. I manage supply manifests, transit permissions, docking fees. The quiet arithmetic of a civilization that moves cargo between stars and does not. As a rule, think very much about the ships that protect it, from having to think about anything else. That is what I was doing on Relay Station Miroth the morning the third convergence arrived. Sitting at a routing desk, reconciling a discrepancy in a fuel invoice, when the station shuddered gently, and every light in my office turned amber. The third convergence was 9,000 ships. I say that plainly because I have learned in the months since that people who were not there tend to hear it as a metaphor. 9,000. They nod, they picture something large, they move on. They do not understand that I mean 9,000 individual warships, 9,000 discrete hulls, carrying 9,000 complement rosters and 9,000 drive signatures, arranged in a formation so broad that from the station's observation deck you could not see the edge of it in any direction. The formation filled the viewport the way a wall fills a room. You turned left, warships. You turned right, warships. You looked down, the ecliptic plane where the corridor opened, warships. The stars themselves were mostly hidden. I was not supposed to be there when they arrived. My transit permit had cleared 3 days earlier. The departure queue had been delayed twice by administrative holds I did not control, and so I was still on Miroth when the Dominion's third convergence translated into local space at 0340 station time, and the docking master woke the entire facility with a 3-tone alert that meant, simply, military commandeered. We were a staging platform now. The Keth collective mind had decided. I understand the consensus differently than a soldier would. I am not hardwired into the command lattice. Civilians of my clearance level receive a filtered presence signal through our communications implants, a low, smooth, continuous hum of shared intention that we are trained from childhood to interpret as the background noise of belonging. It is not words. It is closer to the feeling of a room where everyone already agrees. You know what the Dominion intends because you feel what the Dominion intends. And what the Dominion intends is simply correct because the Dominion is 900 billion minds thinking one thought at a time. The thought that morning was, the corridor will be cleared by midday. There was a human warship in the corridor. This Fritzinisi off as a young logistics named Sethari Voss, who had been stationed on Miroth for 2 years, and who seemed to find the whole situation more interesting than alarming. She took me to the observation deck before the light had fully changed. The amber alerts were still cycling and pointed at the viewport's lower quadrant, where the corridor entrance opened into a navigational choke between 2 gravitational bodies. There, she said. I looked. At first, I saw nothing but the convergence formation, rank after rank of Keth destroyers and cruisers. The silhouettes of our carrier hulls, dark against the ambient light of the system's primary. Then Sethari adjusted the viewport's magnification, and I saw it. It was a long ship. That was my first thought. It is a very long ship. I am not skilled at estimating warship dimensions, but Sethari told me later, after reviewing the station's sensor records, that the hull measured 2 kilometers from bow to stern. A wedge-shaped design, blunt at the nose, tapering to a drive cluster at the rear that put out a heat signature our sensors logged as anomalous. No classification available. The hull was not clean. It was dark alloy, weathered in the way that means not cosmetic wear but actual use. Scorch marks, mismatched plating along the midsection, where repairs had been made with whatever was to hand. A long diagonal scoring on the port flank that had been welded over but not resurfaced. It carried no running lights that I could see. It sat in the corridor, approach without maneuvering, without broadcasting, without doing anything at all, except existing in a place the Dominion had decided it should not exist. The consensus hum in my implant shifted slightly, not words. A sharpening of attention. 900 billion minds briefly, all looking at the same thing. The Dominion assigned 200 ships to clear the obstruction. I watched them go. 200 Keth warships. Each one between 600 and 900 meters. Each one carrying weapons platforms that had ended engagements in under 4 minutes, peel away from the formation's lower edge, and advance in a coordinated spread toward the corridor. The consensus managed their movements the way it manages everything, without individual commands, without discussion. Each ship simply knew where to be. The formation was flawless. I went back to my office. The fuel invoice was not going to reconcile itself. The consensus hum was confident, and confidence is, in the Keth experience, a reliable indicator of outcome, because the Keth collective mind does not feel confident unless it has already processed the engagement model, and the engagement model has returned a satisfactory result. We have been wrong before, but rarely, and not about military engagements, and not against a single ship. An hour later, Sathari knocked on my office door and said very quietly, "You should come look." The 200 ships had not reported back. This happens occasionally. Communications can be disrupted in corridor approach by gravitational interference. There are protocols. The consensus hum was doing something I had not felt before, which was a kind of sustained recalculation. Not the smooth confidence of a decided mind, but the slower, more deliberate processing of one that has been handed new data and is folding it in. I had only felt that recalculation once before, during the Oresi border incident, and it had resolved in 11 minutes. I expected it to resolve in 11 minutes. The human ship had moved, not toward us, not in any direction that suggested engagement with the main formation. It had moved toward where the 200 ships had been, and it was moving at a velocity our sensor log described as consistent with attack posture, and then, in the next entry, updated to no matching profile, classification pending. There was a significant difference between those two entries, and the difference was 340 kilometers per hour. I am going to describe what I watched from that observation deck with as much honesty as I can manage, which means acknowledging that some of what I understood afterward, when the records had been reviewed and the numbers had been confirmed. In the moment, I understood less. What I saw was the shape of what happened. The Dominion sent 400 more ships. I felt this in the consensus hum as a clarification of intent. The collect mind had processed the first engagement result, had assigned a higher capability weighting to the obstruction, and had responded in proportion, 400 ships. This is not a small commitment for a corridor clearing operation. This is the kind of force you send when you want to be thorough. The consensus does not feel impatient. I want to be clear about that. The Keth collective mind, as I have known it for 31 years, does not have moods in the way that individuals do. It has states of attention, states of resource allocation, states of strategic priority. What I was feeling in my implant, as the 400 ships advanced, and the sensor log continued updating, was closer to a sustained increase in priority weighting. The corridor had become more interesting to the consensus than it had been before. The 400 ships did not report back either. Sathari and I stood at the observation deck for a long time without speaking. Below us, in the main formation, I could see the subtle adjustments of 9,000 ships reorienting slightly, not retreating. The consensus does not retreat from a classification problem, but attending more directly to the corridor. I had the uncomfortable sense that I was watching a very large, very calm intelligence decide to pay full attention to something it had initially dismissed, and that the something was going to experience what full attention from 900 billion minds felt like. The Dominion sent 800 ships, then, 11 minutes later, it sent 2,000 more. I am not a military analyst. I cannot tell you with precision what the engagements looked like on a tactical level, because our sensor logs captured contacts and velocities and weapon discharge signatures, and the analysis I was able to read afterward was written for audiences with training I do not have. What I can tell you is what I saw with my own eyes through the viewport of Relay Station Miroth's observation deck, which was this. The corridor was lit, not dimly, not in the thin flicker of point defense exchanges. It was bright, the kind of bright that makes the viewport wart's automatic tinting engage, because otherwise you would damage your eyes looking at it. Weapon fire is visible in vacuum only when it strikes something, or when it ignites gases from a breached hull, and the corridor was lit from end to end, which meant that things were being breached continuously, and the things being breached were not all on the same side of the exchange. I heard someone behind me say, "Collective is not achieving suppression." I turned. It was a military analyst. I recognized her rank marks, a 3-7 specialist, the kind of officer who reads sensor logs and translates them into decision briefs for the consensus lattice. She was standing 3 meters back from the viewport, holding a data slate, and her expression was one I did not have a precise word for. It was not fear. The Keth individually do not feel fear the way isolated species do. Consensus provides a persistent sense of contextual awareness and managed response that converts most fear-adjacent emotions into something more, like heightened attention. What she looked like was a person who was receiving information that did not fit any model she had been trained to apply. "How many ships have we committed to the corridor?" I asked. She looked at me for a moment, then at the data slate. "Committed and not returned, 2,314. I looked back at the viewport. The human ship was still in the corridor. Could not see it clearly at this distance. The light from the engagements was too intense, but I could see its drive signature on the viewports. Passive overlay, a steady amber dot that had not stopped and had not turned, and had not, at any point in the hours since I had first looked at it, behaved in any way that the consensus's engagement models had predicted it would behave. It was moving, the analyst told me, the main formation. Not in a threatening posture, not with weapons active, not broadcasting anything. Just moving. The way something moves when it has decided where it is going, and is going there. Consensus hum changed in a way I am still not sure I can describe accurately. I will try. For 31 years, collective signal in my implant has been smooth. It is the smoothness of a mind that is always in agreement with itself, always processing, always current. Even during the Arisi incident, even during the recalculation, there was a fundamental coherence to it. A sense that the disagreement between incoming data and existing models was being handled. That resolution was a matter of time and processing, and not a matter of anything more fundamental. What I felt in the corridor hum that afternoon was different. It was as though the smoothness had developed a texture. Not a fracture, not yet, but a roughness. The way a river sounds different when there is something in it that does not belong. The analyst left the observation deck. She did not tell me what she was going to do, and I did not ask. I stayed at the viewport. The Dominion made a decision I had never seen it make. It reconfigured the entire third convergence formation. Not a partial reassignment, not a corridor-specific task force. All 9,000 ships, or what remained of the 9,000, because several hundred had now been committed to corridor approaches, began to reorient. The formation, which had been an assembly pattern for a staging operation, shifted into something else. It tightened. The outer elements came inward. The carrier hulls moved to the center, surrounded by the destroyers. It looked, from the observation deck, like a very large organism deciding to defend itself. I had never seen the Keth military assume a defensive posture before. I mean that as a factual statement, not a dramatic one. The Keth Dominion has been a military power in this sector for 400 years. Project force. We establish corridors. We clear obstructions. We do not, as a rule, place our carrier hulls behind a defensive screen, because to do so requires the consensus to model a threat that can reach the carrier hulls. 400 years, the consensus had not modeled such a threat in any regional engagement. The consensus had been in this respect correct. The human ship was 11,000 kilometers from the edge of the formation. I looked at the drive signature on the overlay, and I thought, clarity that surprised me. It is not slowing down. It was not slowing down. I have tried since. Understand what the next 4 hours meant in purely quantitative terms. Because quantitative terms are easier to convey than experiential ones. The third convergence committed the remainder of its available ships in successive waves. The engagement models were updated 6 times. Consensus recalculated its capability assessment of the human vessel upward with each wave, and with each update the force commitment increased, and with each increase the return rate from the corridor approach fake formations decreased until it reached a threshold that the analyst's report, which I read 3 weeks later, described as operationally non-recoverable. What I experienced was quieter than that makes it sound. There is a particular quality to watching something that should not be possible happen in front of you, at a pace slow enough that you keep expecting to stop. The consensus hum had developed that texture I mentioned, and it did not smooth out. It roughened further, and then further still, until at some point in the third hour I realized I was not feeling a unified current anymore. I was feeling something closer to many currents. Not separated, not fractured, but distinct in a way they had not been before. As though 900 billion minds, in trying to process the same unresolvable datum, were each arriving at slightly different internal weightings. And the differences were, the first time, perceptible. The Keth do not have a word for individual fear. I know this because I was educated on the subject as a child. The consensus presence eliminates it. That is one of the purposes of the consensus, one of its oldest functions. Isolation is the root of fear in social species, and the Keth are never isolated. What I was feeling in my implant, in the roughness of the collective signal, was not individual fear. But it was something the consensus was doing for the first time in my experience, which was trying to find the nearest word for something it had not encountered before, and coming back, repeatedly, empty. I want to explain what that means, because I do not think people who have never carried a consensus implant understand how absolute that emptiness was. The Keth collective mind is, in the truest sense of the phrase, never at a loss. It contains the processing history of 900 billion individual intelligences, accumulated over a civilization that predates written records. When it encounters something new, it finds the nearest category, adjusts the weighting, and files it. The filing takes milliseconds. There is always a nearest category. There has always been a nearest category. The archive is deep enough that even the most anomalous datum finds a neighbor. The consensus spent 11 minutes in the corridor engagement, searching the archive for a neighbor. I felt all 11 minutes. At the end of them, the archive returned nothing, and the consensus did something I had no reference for. It kept searching. Not with the brisk efficiency of a system processing toward resolution, with the slower, repeated, slightly different angle of a mind that cannot accept the null result and is trying the query again, in case it phrased it wrong the first time. The human ship reached the edge of the formation. It did not accelerate. It did not broadcast. It did not posture or announce itself or do any of the things that appear in our records of prior engagements as precursors to a main engagement. It simply entered the formation the way you enter a room, because the room was there, and the destination was on the other side. I cannot tell you with precision what happened inside the formation during the following 90 minutes, because I was on an observation deck and not a tactical bridge end, because the sensor logs from that period have been classified at a level I do not have clearance to read. I can tell you what was visible from my position, which was the light and the movement, and the way the formation itself responded. The formation tried to close around it. This is the consensus's answer to a penetrating element. The surrounding units converge, reduce the available operating volume, force the element to address threats from multiple vectors simultaneously. It works. It has worked for 400 years. It works because the surrounding units are coordinated by the same consciousness and respond to each other's movements without lag, without miscommunication, without the hesitation that affects species, relying on individual-to-individual command chains. The formation converged. The light intensified. The formation converged more. The light did not stop. At some point, and I am aware this is a strange thing to say about a military engagement, I stopped watching the light and started watching the drive signature, the amber dot on the overlay. It moved through the formation the way a needle moves through cloth, is to say that it moved through the formation and out the other side, and it did not stop, and it did not turn. And the heading it was maintaining was not the corridor it had come from, and was not the station, and had not been the station, and had never been the station. The human ship had a destination. It was past us. Somewhere past the formation, past the corridor, past Miroth and the staging operation, and the 9,000 ships that the Keth Dominion had committed to the third convergence, the Aurelian. I learned its name later from a transmission log that the consensus had captured during the engagement and translated as part of its post-analysis. The Aurelian had a destination, and the corridor was on the way to that destination, and the 9,000 ships were in the corridor, and the Aurelian had gone through them. I do not know how long I stood at the observation deck after the drive signature cleared the far edge of the sensor range. Long enough that my legs ached when I finally moved. Long enough that the station's amber lighting had cycled back to standard illumination, which happens automatically when the military commandeered alert is downgraded. And the alert had been downgraded because the obstruction was no longer present and the corridor was no longer contested, and the third convergence no longer had a staging objective, because the staging objective had been the corridor, and the corridor was now, from a Keth military perspective, whatever you call a corridor that something has simply walked through. The consensus hum was quiet. Not absent. I want to be precise about this. The signal was still there. I could feel the collective presence in my implant the way you can feel your own heartbeat if you hold still long enough. It was quiet in a way I had not experienced in 31 years of carrying the implant, which is to say that the smooth, unified current of 900 billion minds, thinking the same thought, was not smooth. The currents I had felt developing during the engagement had not remerged. They were present simultaneously, moving in the same general direction, separately. And the separateness had a quality I recognized only because I had spent 31 years in administrative work reading reports about species that did not have a consensus mind, so species that arrived at decisions through deliberation and disagreement and individual conviction. And I had always found those reports a little difficult to imagine from the inside. I was imagining them now, briefly, from the inside of a consensus that was doing something new. I found Sethari Voss in the docking master's office, running inventory on the station's remaining supplies. She had the focused look of someone who has decided that the most useful thing to do in the immediate aftermath of an incomprehensible event is a task with a known completion condition. I understood the impulse. I had spent the walk from the observation deck calculating, automatically, how long the station's fuel reserves would last with the formation depleted and no resupply scheduled. And I had gotten 3/4 of the way through the arithmetic before I realized what I was doing and stopped. There are moments when the mind chooses logistics because logistics has an answer, and the thing that happened does not. How many? I asked. She looked up. She knew what I was asking. The logs are still compiling, she said. The consensus hasn't finalized the accounting yet, roughly. She was quiet for a moment. The third convergence committed 8,400 ships to corridor engagement and formation defense. The sensor logs show 31 returning to formation position in the final hour. The analysis team is still working on the others. I did not say anything. There was not anything to say that would have added to or subtracted from those numbers. 31 ships. From 9,000. I have thought, since that day, about what the human ship was carrying that made it worth sending. I have thought about what mission profile justifies one ship entering a 9,000 ship formation and going through it because the formation was between the ship and its destination. I have thought about who decided and how the decision was framed, and whether the person who made it knew what the third convergence was and sent the Aurelian anyway, or knew and did not care, knew and factored it into the mission the way you factor in weather. As a condition of transit, not a reason to alter course. I have not been able to determine which of those possibilities is more unsettling. The Dominion convened a consensus review. Is the mechanism by which 900 billion minds compare their individual processing logs after an anomalous event. I am not cleared to know the review's conclusions. What I know is that the review took 9 days. The standard resolution time for the Oresi incident was 11 minutes. I have done 31 years of administrative work for an organization that runs on the efficiency of a unified mind, and 9 days is a number that does not fit the framework I have spent my career operating within. The consensus hums smooth, eventually. 3 weeks. It is not quite the same as it was before, and I am not sure whether that is a property of the signal or a property of the receiver, whether the consensus changed or whether I changed. Standing at that viewport, watching something that the 900 billion mind intelligence of the Keth Dominion had no framework for, and had to build one, live, the cost of 8,000 and however many else ships. What I know is this. The Aurelian was logged in no archive the Dominion maintains, no hull signature, No drive profile, no weapons classification. The post-analysis team ran comparisons against every human vessel on record, not just in our sector, but in the full archive going back 300 years of Keth human contact. Closest hull signature match was a decommissioned class that the humans had retired before I was born. The consensus's conclusion, which was shared at the clearance level available to administrative staff, was that the Aurelian represented a capability the Dominion had not modeled and did not have a classification framework for, and that the corridor incident should be logged as a Category 1 assessment revision. Category 1 is a designation I had, in 31 years, never seen applied. I stayed on Muroth for 4 more months, while the station was assessed for damage. There had been some, from weapons exchanges in the outer formation edge, and while the transit queues returned to normal, I filed a report about the fuel invoice discrepancy that had kept me on the station past my departure date. The discrepancy was a rounding error. It had always been a rounding error. I had simply not found it before the amber lights came on. On the day I finally departed, I stood at the observation deck one last time, looking at the corridor entrance. It was empty. The gravitational bodies on either side were the same as they had always been. The light from the system primary came through at the same angle it had always come through. There was nothing in the corridor. There was nothing in the corridor because the Aurelian had somewhere to be, and the corridor had been on the way, and it was done with the corridor now. I have been a logistics administrator for 31 years. I know how to count things. I can tell you that the third convergence began at 034 station time on the 17th day of the 6th month, and that the sensor log's last contact with the Aurelian's drive signature came at 1912 station time on the same day, and that in the intervening 15 hours and 32 minutes, 8 369 Keth warships were accounted for in the post-engagement census in a status that the military classification system lists as non-recoverable. One ship. It had somewhere to be. The corridor was on the way. That is all I can tell you about what I saw. I have been trying in the months since find a way to make it mean something with more shape than that, and I keep arriving at the same place, which is that the shape of it is already the whole thing. The Aurelian was going somewhere, and the 9,000 ships were between it and there, and the 9,000 ships are not between anything now, and the Aurelian is wherever it was going, and the consensus of 900 billion minds spent 9 days and 3 weeks trying to find a word for what it had experienced, and the word it arrived at is not one that appears in any Keth text I was educated on, because the Keth, in 900 billion minds and 400 years of recorded history, had never needed it before. I am not going to tell you the word. I am not sure the translation holds. What I will tell you is that I still feel the change in the consensus hum, the roughness at the edge of the signal, where the smooth current of shared certainty used to run unbroken. It is smaller now. It has almost smoothed back to once it was, but not quite. And when I stand at a viewport now, any viewport, looking at any corridor, or any approach lane, or any stretch of open space, I find that I look a little longer than I used to. I look for amber drive signatures on the passive overlay. I look for hull shapes that do not match the archive. I look for the thing that has somewhere to be and has decided that whatever is in the way is simply logistically in the way. I have not found one yet. I do not know if that is reassuring.